Jacobs was an Australian folklorist, literary critic, historian and writer of English literature who became a notable collector and publisher of English folklore. His work went on to popularize some of the world's best-known versions of English fairy tales, including Jack and the Beanstalk, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, The Three Little Pigs, Jack the Giant Killer, and the history of Thumb. He published his English fairy tale collections, English Fairytales in 1890 and More English Fairytales in 1894, but also went on after and in between both books to publish fairy tales collected from continental Europe as well as Jewish, Celtic and Indian fairy tales, which made him one of the most popular writers of fairy tales for the English language. Jacobs was also an editor for journals and books on the subject of folklore, which included editing the Fables of Bidpai and the Fables of Aesop, as well as articles on the migration of Jewish folklore. He also edited editions of The 1001 Nights. He went on to join the Folklore Society in England and became an editor of the society journal Folklore. Jacobs also contributed to the Jewish Encyclopedia. Biography. Jacobs was born in Australia. He was the sixth surviving son of John Jacobs, a publican who had emigrated from London around 1837, and his wife Sarah, an acute Myers. Jacobs was educated at Sydney Grammar School and at the University of Sydney, where he won a scholarship for classics, mathematics and chemistry. He did not complete his studies in Sydney, but left for England at the age of 18 and entered St John's College, Cambridge. He graduated with a B.A. in 1876, and in 1877 studied at the University of Berlin. Jacobs married Georgina Horn and fathered two sons and a daughter. In 1900, when he became revising editor of the Jewish Encyclopedia, based in New York, he settled permanently in the United States. He died on the 30th of January 1916 at his home in Yonkers, New York. Career. Jacobs was secretary of the Society of Hebrew Literature from 1878 to 1884, and in 1882, came into prominence as the writer of a series of articles in the Times on the persecution of Jews in Russia. This led to the formation of the Mansion House Fund and Committee, of which Jacobs was secretary from 1882 to 1900. In 1888, he prepared with Lucian Wolff the Bibliotheca Anglo-Judaica, a bibliographical guide to Anglo-Jewish history, and in 1890, he edited English Fairy Tales, the first of his series of books of fairy tales published during the next 10 years. He wrote many literary articles for the Athenaeum, which published in 1891 the collection George Eliot, Matthew Arnold, Browning, Newman, Essays and Reviews from the Athenaeum. In the same year appeared his Studies in Jewish Statistics, in 1892, Tennyson and In Memoriam, and in 1893, his important book on the Jews of Angevin, England. In 1894, were published his Studies in Biblical Archaeology, and an inquiry into the sources of the history of the Jews in Spain, in connection with which he was made a corresponding member of the Royal Academy of History of Madrid. His historical novel dealing with the life of Jesus, as others saw him, a retrospective A.D. 54, was published anonymously in 1895. In the following year his Jewish Ideals and Other Essays came out. In this year, he was invited to the United States of America to give a course of lectures on the philosophy of Jewish history. The Story of Geographical Discovery was published towards the end of 1898 and ran into several editions. He had been compiling and editing the Jewish Yearbook since 1896, and was president of the Jewish Historical Society of England in 1898–9. In 1900, he accepted an invitation to become revising editor of the Jewish Encyclopedia, which was then being prepared at New York. He settled permanently in the United States, where he wrote many articles for the Jewish Encyclopedia, and was generally responsible for the style of the whole publication. It was completed in 1906. He then became registrar and professor of English at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York. In 1908, he was appointed a member of the Board of Seven, which made a new English translation of the Bible for the Jewish Publications Society of America. In 1913, he resigned his positions at the seminary to become editor of the American Hebrew. In 1920, Book One of his Jewish Contributions to Civilization, which was practically finished at the time of his death, was published at Philadelphia. In addition to the books already mentioned, Jacobs edited the Fables of Aesop as first printed by Caxton, Painter's Palace of Pleasure, Baltasar Gracian's Art of Worldly Wisdom, Howell's Letters, Balaam and Josaphat, The 1001 Nights, and others. Jacobs was also a contributor to the Encyclopaedia Britannica and James Hastings' Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics. Folklore. From 1899 to 1900 he edited the journal Folklore, and from 1890 to 1916 he edited multiple collections of fairy tales: English fairy tales, Celtic fairy tales, More Celtic fairy tales, More English fairy tales, Indian fairy tales, European folk and fairy tales, which were published with distinguished illustrations by John Dickson Batten. He was inspired in this by the Brothers Grimm in the romantic nationalism common in folklorists of his age. He wished English children to have access to English fairy tales, whereas they were chiefly reading French and German tales. In his own words, what Perrault began, the Grimms completed. Although he collected many tales under the name of fairy tales, many of them are unusual sorts of tales. Binary and Tamlin are prose versions of ballads. The Old Woman and Her Pig is a nursery rhyme. Henny Penny is a fable, and The Buried Moon has mythic overtones to an extent unusual in fairy tales. According to his own analysis of English fairy tales, of the 87 tales contained in my 2 volumes, 38 are march and proper, 10 sagas are legends, 19 drolls, 4 cumulative stories, 6 beast tales, and 10 nonsense stories. Works.